Well, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. Well, it's good afternoon where I am. If you're anywhere else in the world, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depends on where you are. So welcome to this webinar. Looking at the number of attendees, I think it's fast approaching a record attendance, I guess, a bit like me. You're all sat at home. I normally try and visualize where you all are. And I guess normally a lot of you are sat at your work, sat at your desk at your workplace. Probably like me today, you sat from home looking out as I am at a sunny sky. Sadly, I can't deliver this from outside. Anyway, welcome, and just to make sure that you're all in the right place, we're going to be having a look at over this next sort of 3/4 of an hour to an hour about what are known as definitive interpretations for several of the clauses of ISO 14001-2015. So what we're going to be looking at, I aim to talk, as I say, for about probably 40-45 minutes, and then we're going to have a section towards the end for questions. If you want to ask questions as we're going along, feel free to do that. You should see on the right hand side of your screen a box for questions. I've already had a hello, good afternoon, somebody from Cyprus listening in, very, very welcome. So we've already had one question in there, or a comment, but if you want to add any comments or any questions as you go along, if I think it's the right time to answer that at the time, we will do. If not, there will be a section at the end, and I'm not time constrained this afternoon. We can take as long as you like. I've nowhere to go, so we'll see how long that takes. So we're going to have a look at who are ISO TC 207 SC1. You'll have seen that on the front of the slide, the very first slide, and you'll also see it on the slide in front of you. What are interpretations? Then we're going to have a look at the bulk of it is going to be looking at the updated interpretations, and then towards the end, how to keep in touch with us, how to keep in touch with me, and a selection of questions, as I say, at the end. There's no need to frantically scribble everything down as we're going through this presentation. Everybody who's registered, whether you actually attended or not, and as I say, I think looking now, it's now a record for one of my webinars, so that's good. Thank you all. So everybody who's registered will get a copy of the presentation in PDF format, and also all of our presentations are recorded, and they will be appearing on our YouTube channel, the NQA YouTube channel, usually in a few days afterwards, so probably early next week. You'll get the slides and you'll get a recording of this webinar. As I've mentioned, what is the record? I'm not going to tell you that. We're well into three figures, massively into three figures. That's where we are, Andrew. But we are over my record at the moment for one of my individual webinars. We did do a webinar, NQA, about it was 2016, I think it was, on the first anniversary of the publication of ISO 14001-2015, where this system actually started to crash because we had over 1,000 people tuning in. I can assure you we're nowhere near that at the moment, but we're into several tiers of three figures. Okay, so questions, as I say, ask them as we go along. If I feel it's appropriate to answer, we will. Hope you enjoy the afternoon. It's not really a multimedia extravaganza. There's no photos in there. It's listening to me talk. I'll try and do it in as light-hearted way as I can, and try and explain what this is all about. So we're going to have a quick look at the ISO committee structure, a little bit about the review process, how this committee actually reviews questions that are sent to it. We're going to have a look at some interpretations of clause of the standard. I'm going to cover 22 today. There's actually a few more than that, but some of them are a bit repetitive. So I've pulled out the ones that I think are most important. However, if you want to have a look, there is a link there, which is to, it's a bit of a long link, but if you copy and paste that into your browser, you'll get straight to the page that's then got a link to the interpretations. The list of interpretations on their site actually does cover all the interpretations they've ever done. So it includes last year's as well. Now, some of you may have sat in on a webinar I did probably February, March last year when I looked at the previous year's interpretations. So this builds on that. I'm not covering anything that was done 12 months ago. These are the new interpretations. Somebody's saying they've got no audio. That might be your setting rather than mine, because I can actually, I'm guessing lots of other people can hear because I'm getting some questions. So Jane, you might want to just have a look at your settings, although you can't hear what I'm saying if I'm saying that. Thank you, everybody else. So it's clearly that good. Thank you everybody. Can you stop sending? Yes, that's fine. Thank you. Yes, you can all hear me. Thank you. I might regret saying that. Okay, thank you. So let's move on. So ISO TC207 SC1. You might wonder who on earth they are. Well, we all spend all our lives, or a lot of our lives, I'm guessing, from looking at the people who've signed into this webinar, working with ISO 14001, and somebody somewhere, a group of people, had to be responsible for this thing. It didn't just magically appear. And TC207 are the ISO Technical Committee that actually was responsible for all of this. And SC1 is subcommittee 1. And as I said, they are the subcommittee responsible for this standard. They wrote it, they had it agreed, and we used to think it stood for Travel Club because they meet all over the world apparently, but no, TC does stand for Technical Committee. And they support ISO 14001 and all the other family of standards that sort of sit around that standard. So 14004, 14002, and all the other ones that you can see listed towards the bottom of your screen. I've pinched this little graphic from their slide because this explains a little bit about what they do. So 14001 is the core of their activities, and everything else around there sort of fits into those four main sort of headings: evaluating strategic and monetary consequences, policy and organizational elements, evaluating consequences of environmental aspects, and overall understanding and implementation. So that's basically what they do. And one of their key activities, or one of the things that they do look at, is this interpretation process. And interpretations appear because what tends to happen, certification bodies like ourselves might come in and raise a finding, and all certification bodies, including NQA, we have an appeals process. And if you disagree with the finding, if you disagree with an interpretation from your assessor, you can, in the UK, go via BSI standards. That's not BSI certification, that's a slightly different animal. You can go to BSI standards, who are our national UK standards body. In any other country, it would be your own national standards body. And you can request an interpretation. Now, they may choose to answer that themselves, or more likely, they would forward that to this technical committee, TC207 Subcommittee 1. And all requests received and all formal responses given are included in an annual compilation of interpretations. Now, one of the things I've started to do, as I did last year, and it seems to be fairly popular, is to run a little session like this where we have a look at some of those interpretations, and I sort of go through them from a certification body process, or perspective rather, and maybe put my little spin on them. Not that I'm changing what that means, but sometimes I find they can be a little bit difficult to understand, even the wording. If you want to see the actual wording, go back to the link that I had on the second or third slide, whichever slide it was, because some of them run to 2 or 3 pages, the answers, and I've tried to paraphrase and distill them down so that I can fit them all, in most cases, onto one slide. Somebody's saying, can anyone hear a high-pitched echo? I can't. Can anybody else? And please don't deluge me with responses, but there's somebody saying they can hear a high-pitched echo. You shouldn't be able to, because I've got the mic on and no speakers at my end, so it shouldn't be. There you go. And I'm sorry, it might just be yourself. A couple of other people are saying they can't. Some people are hearing a bit of crackling, but again, that might be at their end. Okay, thanks. John Bloom is saying you can't hear any extraneous noises, so that's good. Okay, so what happens is SC1, Subcommittee 1, look at all of these requests for interpretation and then come up with their set interpretation. It doesn't change the meaning of the clause of the standard, but they are there to give a little bit more detail about what the intention was when a particular clause was written. And obviously the intention is best written out by the people who wrote the thing in the first place, because they understood what they actually meant by it. And as I've said, they make an annual compilation available, and I've chosen to use that compilation as a way of running a little bit of a webinar like this that might make it interesting. So from here on inwards, the next 20 odd slides are the actual interpretations. The way I've set them out, I'll pose the question first, which will appear in red, and then the answer will come up. As I said, sometimes it's been slightly distilled down to fit it onto one page, and I'll have a little bit of a chat maybe then about what's it actually saying. So here we go. So the first one is a general inquiry. You'll find in the top left-hand corner, I've also put the clause of the standard that it refers to. This actually possibly does refer to a clause of a standard, but it was actually posed as a legal question. And it's where to draw the borderline between legal requirements on the protection of natural environment and those protecting occupational health and safety issues. And that had been raised by a certification body, not in this country, I hasten to add, but by a certification body. It had been raised as a non-conformance because an organisation's system was not including health and safety legislation. So it was an EMS, environmental management system, but the company hadn't included health and safety legislation, and it had been raised as a non-conformance by that certification body. The answer was that all organisations are obliged to comply with all applicable legislation. I think that's a given. ISO 9001 tells us that as well. We have to comply with all applicable legislation. However, ISO 14001, and this goes for the same for ISO 45001 in terms of health and safety, ISO 50001 in terms of energy. The standard says the organisation shall determine and have access to compliance obligations. That's the standard term for mainly legislative, but also includes other requirements related to its environmental aspects. And I've underlined that and put it in bold because that's important. So if there are no environmental aspects that can be linked to occupational health and safety issues, then they don't have to be included. Obviously, it is acceptable, and I have a number of clients that do this, that if you're going to set up a legal register, you might as well include other things as well. But from a certification body point of view, the only thing that we should be looking at, the only thing that we will be looking at are pieces of legislation that, as the standard says, are related to your defined environmental aspects. If you want to put other things in there, that's fine. And we might have a look at them and we might give a bit of an educated view on them, but we certainly won't be auditing them and raising findings against them. So that's the first one out the way, and we'll keep on like this, going through all of the slides until we get to the end. Okay, slide number 2. In some places in the standard, the organisation is directed to take certain items into account, whilst in other places in the standard, the organisation is directed to consider certain items. Is there a difference? Now, for those of you that have sat through other webinars that I've carried out, that I've delivered both on 14,001 and also on 50,001, because I've run a number on 50,001, and there's a few scheduled on the Hang on, somebody's saying the clause number is not appearing in the top left-hand corner. On this one, you might see the word general, because we haven't got to ones that cover clauses yet. But there will be some clause numbers appearing on the top left-hand side. If you can see the whole slide, the clause numbers are in the top left-hand corner. In all the webinars, when I talk about transitions to the new standards, I talk about the Annex SL format, which is a format that all these new standards in. But one of the things I talk about is the difference between taking into account and considering. And what the standard says, both of those words have specific intent. And remember this, because this might crop up. In fact, this does crop up in another slide later on in terms of the words consider and take into account. So the word consider means it's necessary to think about the topic, but it can be excluded. So in other words, you've looked at something, you've thought about it, and you've decided not to put it in. Take into account means that you've got to think about it. Yes, you've got to consider it, but actually, having considered it, you do have to include it within the system wherever it's meant to be. So take into account means you can't exclude it, consider means you can. That's a fairly straightforward one. In section 3 of the standard, now section 3 relates to terms and definitions. Is this section binding? And if so, may an auditor determine whether appropriate environmental objectives have been set to meet the requirements of the definitions of clause 3.2.6. Now, obviously the definitions section, which begins at the beginning, is section 3 of the standard, and 3.2.6 defines the phrase environmental objective, and it says environmental objective, an objective set by the organisation consistent with its environmental policy. So I think what the questioner was asking was, if a policy, or if an objective rather, doesn't comply with the or isn't consistent with its environmental policy, can it be raised as a non-conformance? Now, the answer that came from the subcommittee was the only sections against which an audit is carried out are sections 4 to 10. So section 4 begins with context of the organisation and goes right the way through to the end, which is obviously the section on improvement. Section 3 is a section that clarifies some of the terminology that is used within the standard. So therefore, section 3 is not auditable. So if the environmental objectives are consistent with the policy and their development has taken into account the organisation's significant aspects and compliance obligations, then the objectives are consistent with the standard. But that information doesn't come from section 3.2.6 within the definitions bit. That section will come from the section on environmental objectives, which is clause 6.2.1, which does say in 6.2.1a, the environmental objectives shall be consistent with the policy. So it sounds like it might have been a coding, if you like, or a misnumbering of a finding rather than something being raised incorrectly. So a slightly longer one now. Does ISO 14001 require an organisation to demonstrate that it has addressed requirements related to environmental aspects, significant environmental aspects, policy commitments, context issues and concerns, risks and opportunities and compliance obligations individually for each subclause in 14001? Or can an organisation demonstrate that it has addressed these collectively through the significant environmental aspects determination process? Bit of a mouthful, a lot of stuff in there, and this is one where the answer is actually shorter than the question. So the standard ISO 14001:2015 does not mandate separate processes or procedures to be used for addressing requirements. The standard clearly states that you can basically do things how you like. It tells you what you have to achieve, but not how you have to achieve it, So how you address the requirements of the standard are entirely up to you, providing those requirements have been addressed. So for instance, an organisation might have a single environmental planning process that addresses everything in clauses 4 to 6, or 4 and 6 rather, not 4 to 6. So you might have one particular procedure or a process, it doesn't even have to be a procedure, a process that starts off with context, takes into account those people that might have an interest in your organisation through the needs of interested parties, looks at the scope of the system, and then carries on to look at risks and opportunities, aspects, compliance obligations, and objectives and planning. All of that could actually go in one process, and it doesn't have to be split up. The question sounds like it was asked maybe by an assessor who was used to dealing with the older style standards, where auditing used to be done by clause of the standard, and you would sit down and say, right, I'm now going to audit clause this and I'm going to audit clause that, rather than, as we're all supposed to do now, including internal audits, we're supposed to look at process auditing. And that's what lies behind this particular clause. It's all about process auditing, and what you include within a process is entirely up to you, and it's for you to define what the boundaries of that process are. Right, we're now into specific clauses again. So clauses 611 and 612. So 611 is actions to address risks and opportunities. 612 is environmental aspects. Does ISO 14001:2015 allow an organisation to consider environmental risks and opportunities as environmental aspects, and those aspects that it intends to operate as its significant aspects? So the question here seems to be, and I've seen this in a number of cases and I've tried to steer people away from this, one of the newer requirements in the standards, these new standards, the 2015 standards, and indeed 2018 versions of 50 and 45,001, is this section on risks and opportunities. And risks and opportunities are not quite the same as environmental aspects. And I've been to a number of clients whereby their aspects register has been presented to me as risks and opportunities. Now, the answer that came from the subcommittee about this was that there is a relationship between significant environmental aspects and risks and opportunities, but they're not treated, or not necessarily to be treated, as identical. And I see that, as I say, a lot of times. So the definition of risks and opportunities is not the same as significant environmental aspects. So if I turn up to audit you as an assessor, and I ask to look at your risks and opportunities, and all I see is an aspect register, we're going to have some problems, because there is a requirement that you've considered risks and opportunities. So environmental aspects themselves can result in risks and opportunities, and that can be determined as part of the significance evaluation. So that's fine. I think we all understand that. But there may be other risks and opportunities that need to be addressed in the environmental management system. So when you go through clause 4.1, which is context, one of the things you're looking at are what's out there, what's happening in the world that's going to affect how my environmental management system is running. There's things that are going to help you, there's things that you're going to get in the way. They're not your aspects, but they are risks and they are opportunities, and they need to be taken into account and included within the system. So therefore, in answer to the question, I would say the answer is no. The standard doesn't really allow an organisation to consider environmental risks as aspects, because there are bound to be things going on that affect you as an organisation, that are a risk, that are an opportunity, but are not directly related to your environmental aspects. Now, I do look at some of these questions and wonder what on earth was going on in the minds of the people that asked them, because on the face of it, you might think that this is a bit of a no-brainer. What is meant by the commitment to fulfill its compliance obligations in section 5.2D, which is policy? So if I just turn in my standard, I've got a copy of the standard in front of me. So 5.2D just says the policy must include a commitment to fulfill its compliance obligations. Now, if I was to ask you all to tell me what is meant by your organisation committed to fulfil your compliance obligations? I suspect the vast majority, in fact, I would hope you would all get this question right. You actually got to do what you say you're going to do and got to do what's required of you. That perhaps makes some sense. I'm just pausing slightly because I was just making sure that there was there is a question. Just a point that John's made about the previous slide. This was the one about aspects and risks and opportunities. Putting these two questions together into a single compliance obligations process does actually mean this. Yes, it does, but it's putting them together into a single process, but actually a process, if you like, that's got two tracks. So one looking at risks and opportunities, one looking at aspects, and there may be some crossover in the middle. But yes, you can put them all together into the one process. So coming back to commitment to compliance obligations, as I say, I would have thought that we all understood what that meant. The answer from the committee, I might have given a slightly more blunt answer to this one, but the answer that the committee gave was the relationship between 14,001 and regulatory compliance is addressed in a number of places in the standard, which it is. This commitment is demonstrated through the EMS process and actions that the organisation establishes, implements and maintains. So all of the commitments, all the things we say we're going to do, so all of the, if you like, the voluntary commitments we make, all of the claims we make maybe about our processes, about our products, about our services, all of the legislation that applies to us, all of that should be addressed by the various clauses of the standard and the operational controls and the other areas that we have within our management system. And the commitment to comply is then reinforced by this requirement that top management, and that's the requirement of top management, although they can actually devolve that responsibility, that top management oversees, if you like, the reviewing of the adequacy, the suitability and the effectiveness of the management system in meeting its expected outcome. So therefore, in a long-winded way, basically what it's saying is that your management system should be set out so that it makes sure that you address all of the things that you've got to do, but be it voluntary commitments, be it mandatory legislative requirements, they should all be covered, and top management should make sure that on an annual basis or whatever period you define, and I'm going to withdraw that term annual basis, as you'll see on another slide later on, that on a regular basis that a review is undertaken of those compliance obligations. Now, an interesting point that I've made on previous webinars that I've done and is also reinforced by the subcommittee. Illegal non-compliance is not necessarily raised as an EMS non-conformity if, for example, it is identified and corrected by the EMS process. So if I come in and do an audit, or any assessor comes in and does an audit and finds that there is a legal non-compliance, but you've already found it, it's been detailed as a non-conformance within your EMS, and you are in the process of correcting it, and we can see that progress is being made, we will not raise that as a non-conformance because that shows that the system is working. It will only become a non-conformance if we raise something and you don't know anything about it and you show an element of surprise and you go, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that was happening. That would be a non-conformance. Just to go back, Robert, you might have come in after I started. Yes, you do get a copy of the slides afterwards. Everybody who's registered for the presentation does get a copy of the slides. Okay, moving on. This probably is going to take longer than an hour because it's 2:30 and I'm about a third of the way through these now. So clause 5.2 and clause 4.3. So 5.2 is policy and clause 4.3 is scope. So 5.2 policy states top management shall establish, implement and maintain an environmental policy that within the defined scope of its EMS is blah blah blah. Does this mean that the policy statement must now include wording from the scope statement to link the operations of a location to the policy statement? So in other words, do you have to put in your policy the wording of the scope? Now the answer is basically no, As used in section 5.2, the phrase within the defined scope of its environmental management system is intended to promote consistency between the scope and the policy, but doesn't say that the scope has to include the wording of the policy. There is no requirement that in the standard that an organisation includes specific wording from its scope statement within its policy. So there is no requirement. However, I actually find that it's quite an interesting way of making the scope available to people, because you do have on your certificate, whether it's an NQA certificate or from anybody else, you do have wording of the scope on there, and you've defined the scope within your system. There is a requirement to make that scope publicly available, so why not use it as a starting point within your policy? It sets the scene, if you like, and says what it is you actually do. But if you don't put it in there, it is not a requirement. Right, just a comment, a warning. Here we go. And you're right, this has come from somebody picking up some words that I've just said. Allowing an organisation to review its system at regular intervals may lead to a prolonged regular interval. Regular is a generic term that should be qualified as a minimum with regularity. Please, loose terms are counterproductive. I take your point, Anna. There is an interpretation on that later on. And hopefully that interpretation will answer the point you made. That's why I quickly corrected myself when I said annual, but maybe was a little bit loose by using the term regular. So we'll come back to that, Anna, and hopefully that will satisfy the warning. So policy then, you don't have to stick wording from the scope in there. And if an assessor tries to tell you you should, no, you don't. I personally think that it's a good idea because it sort of sets the scene. I've always said I should be able to pick up a policy in isolation, read the policy and understand what it is you do as a business. And I always think that's a good way of setting out a policy, and including some wording from the scope does help with that. We're still on the policy, a lot of questions about policies. This again is on clause 5.2, which is policy, and 4.3 scope again. In determining whether the environmental policy is appropriate to the purpose and context of the organisation, including the nature, scale and environmental impacts of its activities, products and services, is it relevant for an assessor to determine whether the scope of the policy covers all the management units within the organisation being audited? So in other words, that's saying, is it right for an assessor to actually question the scope and seek to clarify whether the policy covers all of the management units within the organisation being audited? It is the role of an assessor, and I'll just there we go. It is the role of the assessor to determine whether the policy is appropriate for all of those management units that are within the scope of the MS. Remember, it's your role to set the policy, sorry, to set the scope of the system. You decide what the scope is going to be. You decide what's going to be included and what's going to be excluded. And that scope, the wording of that scope, then has to be accurate in terms of what is being covered by the management system. The policy and the policy commitments have to then include all activities, products and services that fall within the boundaries defined. And it is quite right that an assessor should make sure, convince themselves that everything that is within the scope is included within those policy commitments. So therefore, if the scope includes a particular site, and bearing in mind that the policies that we're going to prevent pollution, or you're going to commit to prevent pollution, it's quite right and quite legitimate for an assessor to look at that site and say, is that policy commitment being met at that site? And I think that's what's going on. Okay, right, that was a fairly easy one, I think. Right, clause 6.1.2, we're moving on a little bit now through the standard, and we are going through the standard in numerical order. So 6.1.2 is environmental aspects. And this is one I see quite a lot. Must a regulated environmental aspect automatically be considered a significant environmental aspect? I see a lot of people who've chosen to do this. because they would, right, sorry, I'm just going to jump back because I think this is a relevant question. Can the assessor, this is from Gordon Watts, can the assessor question the scope if it appears to slice out high environmental impact areas? Brackets, not saying we do this. You sure? I think I've seen this happen in the past. Yes, quite rightly so, because you can't use the scope really to exclude whatever the phrase you used, slice out high environmental impact areas. We always tend to say that the scope should be representative of the activities of the organisation. And it's one of the tricks that a lot of people have used fairly early on with some of these standards to get the standard and maybe get the standard only related to the head office. And when you scratch beneath the surface on the scope, you find that it just includes the offices and misses out all the horrible, nasty, dirty factories that they've got. Now, 50,001 energy management's a little bit more, what's the phrase, specific. And I actually like the wording on that. And I would tend to use the wording in that as a little bit of a guide. What 50,001 says is you can't use the scope to exclude a particular usage of an energy source or an energy type. And I think that's quite good advice to think about in terms of a policy and a scope for 14,001. If I as an assessor thought you were doing that, I would certainly be questioning that. Right, yes, please elaborate on boundaries regarded outsourced. There's a question on that, Anna, coming up, so we will cover that. So going back to where we were, must a regulated environmental aspect automatically be considered a significant environmental aspect? No. As I said, as I started saying, this does happen quite a bit. And I have a number of clients who've taken the viewpoint, quite legitimately because it's their viewpoint, that if an aspect is covered by legislation, that is almost a default position, that the fact that legislation is covering it means that it must be in some way significant. Now, what the standard says is that section 612, which is aspects, requires an organisation to determine those aspects that have or can have a significant environmental impact by using established criteria. Now, that's for you as a business to decide what that criteria is going to be. If you decide that that criteria is that everything that's got a legal aspect to it is going to be significant, fine, do that. If you want to come up with a different way of doing it, that's absolutely fine also. Section A62, now anything with an M in front of it is the annex at the back. So section A62, which is the annex and gives some additional guidance on objectives and planning to achieve them, states that environmental criteria are the primary and minimum criteria for assessing aspects. But it is the organisation that sets the criteria for determining which are significant. So if an organisation wants to make it significant, you can, but it's not mandated by the standard, nor can an assessor criticise you or raise a finding to say that you've not used legislation as the only source. If you want to use it as part of that criteria, and a lot of people do that, it might give it a sort of higher ranking, if you like. You're quite entitled to do that. No more questions as yet, so we're keeping going on. That's interesting. I've got the same slide in twice. Not to worry. Right, so the next clause, 6.1.2, that's environmental aspects again. Another one that I see sometimes, and I have to question sometimes people who have to ask questions like this. Is it permissible for a small organisation to declare that they have no significant aspects and still be conformant to the 14,001 standard? I would hope you're all shouting no at the screen. I'll be disappointed if you're not. So the answer is no, if I'm honest. Although there is no explicit requirement in 14,001 that an organisation will identify one or more significant aspects, there is an underlying assumption that you will. So it doesn't explicitly state that you must have at least one significant aspect, but there is this assumption that you will. The intent of this requirement, and this is coming back now to the intent of the people who wrote the thing, the intent of the requirement to determine those aspects that you consider significant is to enable any organisation to focus their attention and resources on the most important aspects, recognising that not all aspects require the same degree of management. So in other words, it's asking you to prioritise the things that you're doing as a business that have an impact on the environment. Now, whether you call them significant or not, some of them are going to be higher profile than others. So significance is intended to be a relevant term. So what's significant for one organisation might not be for another. If you're a huge chemical company with 5,000 staff and a huge plant, your least important aspect might not even come close to registering if you're at the other end of the scale, maybe 10 people working in an office somewhere. But even those 10 people working in an office will have aspects that are more significant than others, and that's what the standard is aiming to achieve. So don't get too hung up in the term significant. It's asking you to basically prioritize which of your aspects are most important to you and you feel the need to focus your resources on addressing. Right, 613. 613 is compliance obligations. This is an interesting one, a very interesting one. Does section 1.613 compliance obligations require that an organisation must have its own direct knowledge of the environmental legal requirements that are applicable to its products in all countries into which they are exported, and not be able to rely on either a related corporate entity which sells the product in a foreign country or an independent importer customer to which it ships the product to have and apply such information? So to put that into hopefully understandable English, you might say that it's already understandable. I had to read it 3 or 4 times before I was fully grasped with it. So if I'm making a product and then exporting that product to, I'm sat here in the UK. So if I'm making a product and exporting that product outside the EU, I'm exporting it to somewhere in Africa. Do I need to have an understanding of, for instance, Nigerian environmental legislation if my product is going to be imported and used in that particular country? Somebody's just put yes. So I don't know whether that means yes to the question that I've just asked. Interestingly, that may be somebody's view. So with regard to products, the standard does not specify geographic boundaries, nor does it specify how you determine an access requirements that you have to be aware of yourselves. Section 611, which is actions to address risks and opportunities, suggests that you have to have a process in place to meet the requirements of clauses 612 to 614, which includes compliance obligations. So therefore, it's up to you as an organisation to establish a process as to how you will determine and have access to such legal requirements. But there is a huge caveat on this, because the standard says in all of this, in terms of aspect, you only have to consider aspects that you can control or influence. If you can't control or influence something, you don't have to take them into account. That's the first thing. The standard also says that you only have to consider compliance obligations related to your environmental aspects. So if you can't control or influence something, then it's not an aspect and you don't have to look at the legal position. So that final paragraph, I think, is the crux of this question. It depends on the level of control or influence an organisation can exercise over the use of its products. So for instance, if I'm making plastic bags that might have a particular piece of legislation attached to them in the UK, and exporting those to, say, Nigeria, where there may be completely different piece of legislation about how my bags are to be used, it's not my responsibility as to how Mrs. Smith in Nigeria might use and dispose of her plastic bags. That is down to Nigerian legislation, which I don't need to be aware of. If my customer in Nigeria comes back to me and places upon me some requirements under the needs of interested parties and says, well, if you're exporting to my country, your plastic bags must meet this, this, and this, then that becomes a compliance obligation, not legislatively, but becomes a compliance obligation environmentally through the needs of interested parties, the interested party being the customer, and it would then become a contractual obligation, not a legislative obligation. Now, somebody's put, quite rightly at John again, this is a major consideration in 9001 and 16949, which is automotive in relation to car makers. Absolutely. It doesn't really affect us in 14001 unless, as I've just explained, it is a client or a client issue come through the needs of interested parties. Another interesting one. Quickly this one. Must an organisation have access to the ISO 14001 standard either in hard copy, via computer, or by an external source, since the organisation is certified to that standard? I suspect this is from somebody who's turned up to, who's had an audit done, and the assessor said, you haven't got a copy of the standard to hand, I'm going to give you a finding. Now, there isn't a yes or no answer to this. The answer that came back says, an organisation seeking to conform to the standard must have access to information related to the standard's requirements, including any subsequent revisions, so that it can take these requirements into account in establishing, implementing and maintaining its environmental management system. They haven't said yes, but I take that to be a yes, really, because if you haven't got a copy of the standard to hand, how are you going to be able to answer the questions that are posed by that statement? So I think really I would expect all my clients to have a copy or have access to a copy of the standard. I'm not going to dwell on that one. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. Right. Clause 613, compliance obligations, and 753, which relates to control of documented control of documented information. Is the standard itself a compliance obligation under clause 613, and is it a document of external origin? Now, I've already double-clicked rather and given you the answer to that one, but basically the answer, yes, it is. So ISO 14001 as a standard is a compliance obligation under the AMS. Some of my clients have it in there, a lot don't. So put it in. It's an easy one because it's an obligation that you have to comply with. It's a voluntary one because you've chosen to do it, but it's an obligation nevertheless. So the relationship between 14001 and compliance is addressed in a number of places in the standard. That's quite right. The commitment is demonstrated through the AMS processes and actions the organisation establishes, implemented and maintains. So the commitment to comply is reinforced by the requirements that top management periodically review the adequacy. That's fine. So yes, it is a compliance obligation. And it is a document of external origin. And I think I've slightly gone wrong there because I think that's actually the wording from a different question. So I do apologise. I'll correct that when I send the slides out. But basically, yes, it is a compliance obligation under clause 613. And it is also a document of external origin. It's the first time I've delivered this presentation, so I think I've slightly gone wrong there. So I will correct that. There is a separate answer to that. So yes, it is a compliance obligation and it is to be treated as a document of external origin, which means that you therefore need to make sure that you keep up to date with any amendments that take place. You needn't worry about keeping up to amendments. People like myself will make sure that you are up to date with amendments. Apologies for that slight mistake in the slides. This sort of comes back to the question I asked earlier, or that was asked earlier. Is it a non-conformance if an organisation establishes environmental objectives, but at the time of the audit, none relate to an identified significant aspect? Okay, so you have some environmental objectives, but actually none of them at the time of an audit relate to an identified significant aspect. And is it a non-conformance? The answer is no, it's not. No, it's not. Now, remember earlier on when we talked about take into account and consider, I said that this may crop up later on. Well, here it is. So clause 621 of the standard, which is environmental objectives, requires that significant aspects and compliance obligations are taken into account when establishing and reviewing environmental objectives. It also requires that risks and opportunities are considered, but it does not explicitly require that there be an objective related to significant aspects, compliance obligations, or risks and opportunities at all times. Okay, so in most cases, yes, you would have objectives covering significant aspects. However, there may be a period of time when there isn't one, where you may have completed one and you haven't set new ones yet, and so you haven't got a current objective. That's not an issue. However, and I think this is the crux of the question, given the required commitment to continual improvement, which is the expected outcome of the standard, it would be expected there would be one or more objectives related to one or more significant aspects. So it's an expectation, not a mandatory requirement, I think is the answer on that one. A lot of questions around objectives. Must objectives be set which are explicitly related to the organisation's commitment to environmental protection, including pollution prevention, or are the scope and content of objectives solely at the discretion of the organisation? So in other words, the policy commits to environmental protection, prevention of pollution, lots of other things like that. Do all the objectives have to explicitly be related to those policy commitments? Now, what this is saying is that it raises the question, or it raises the issue, that you can't read a particular sentence or section of the standard in isolation from all of the other sections of the standard, and that there's quite a relationship, an interrelationship between the requirements in some sections with the requirements in the other sections. And section 6.2 does not say anywhere that the documented objectives explicitly have to cover environmental protection or prevention of pollution. It does require that you as an organisation take into account significant aspects and associated compliance obligations when setting the objectives. So it sort of leads one into another, but it doesn't specifically say that they have to be explicitly related to the commitment to environmental protection, pollution prevention, etc., etc., etc. So it's sort of blurring the edges slightly, and it's suggesting that they ought to, but again, there isn't a set requirement to say that they must be explicitly related. Moving on a bit now into section 7, which is support, and this is a question around competence. Does ISO 14001 imply some consideration by the organisation of legal requirements for the training of employees in establishing competence and training? So in other words, if the law says that you have to have somebody trained to do something, does the standard say that you have to take that into account, really? Now, the answer is, I would say, probably yes, because Section 7.2 requires the determination of training needs associated with an environmental aspects and environmental management system. Now, training needs isn't the immediate thing that you look at in this clause. The first thing you look at is competency needs. And if somebody needs to be competent, it may be that, for example, there is a piece of legislation determining that competence. So as a good example, in the UK, if you're going to be going out as a business and spraying herbicides and pesticides over the ground, then the law states that you have to be certified to a particular level and have to demonstrate that. So that would therefore become a required competency for an operative who was doing that as a job. So in other words, what that's saying is if an organisation is legally required to provide certain kinds of training, Such training should be identified as a need under clause 4.2. Now, needs of interested parties, and that moves us on into the legal register. So the legal register, the evaluation, so the compliance register would say in there, under, in the UK, things like the Control of Pesticides Act, that you would have to be using staff who are certified to the correct levels of certification to carry out that role, and that will apply in many other areas. So basically the answer is yes, but again the standard doesn't specifically say that, but if you sort of scratch below the surface and read the intent of the clauses, it does come out and say that. And you'll find that with a lot of these clauses, that actually the question that was answered is actually the answer's in the standard. You just need to dig a little bit deeper. Now, this is the most complicated one that we've got this afternoon, and it's so complicated it's had to go on to two slides. And I hope I don't get tied in knots with this, but this sort of comes back to a little bit of a question that Anna asked earlier about boundaries regarding outsourced activities. So I'm going to read this question out because it's quite a lengthy question. Company A outsources parts of their production to company B. So there may be metal coating, electroplating, or painting. So let's take electroplating. So I've got a company and I'm outsourcing the electroplating of my components to company B. Company B is a totally separate company, not linked to my company at all, and they're located in a totally different part of the country. They're 200 miles away from where I am, and I send them on the back of a lorry, they get electroplated and they come back. Is company B, so that is my supplier, is company B considered persons doing work under company A's control? That's the first question. If they are, what does 14,001 require me to do regarding ensuring the competency of company B? And what does 14,000 require me to do regarding identifying the training needs for my supplier's employees? Okay, so it's asking about the relationship between me as a manufacturer and in this case a subcontractor, company B, who are quite remote from where I am and are carrying out things on my behalf. Okay, I think we've understood the question. So in the example, company A, this is the answer given by the subcommittee. In the example given, company A would need to determine whether there are any tasks being performed by people within company B that are related to company A's environmental aspects of activities, products or services within its EMS scope. So that's asking us first of all to think about, is company B an outsourced process or is it a supplier? Now, there was some quite detailed questions about this in last year's presentation that I did, and I'm not going to go over it in great detail, but I'm just going to reiterate slightly some points that the standard uses in Annex 8.1. So Annex A 8.1, which is at the back of the standard, and it tells you in the guidance how to decide what is an outsourced process. And an outsourced process is one that fulfills all of the following, not some, all of the following. It has to be within the scope of the EMS. It has to be integral to my organization's functioning. That process is needed for my EMS to achieve its intended outcome. Liability for conforming to requirements is retained by me, and the organization and the external provider have a relationship whereby their process is perceived by interested parties as being carried out by me. Now, if I'm honest, in this instance, an electroplating company 200 miles from my process is not an outsourced process. It is a, yes, you can probably find some links to last year's presentation, probably find those. So it is not an outsourced process. An electroplating company 200 miles away from my site doing some work on some of my components and sending them back to me is a supplier and not an outsourced process. That's the first thing. An outsourced process would be, for example, and this is a real example I've seen, one of my clients that has a large warehouse has so many forklift trucks that the forklift truck supplier has a permanent engineer based on my site or my client's site. So in one corner of the warehouse is a small area designated as belonging to this forklift truck supplier. Their engineer works in there. Their engineer has some tools and oil supplies and various other bits and pieces in there, but they are on my premises. That's an outsourced process. It's taking place on my property. If that guy spilt a drum of oil and it went down my drains, it's my responsibility because he's on my premises. That's an outsourced process, not a supplier. There's a lot of issues around what's an outsourced process and what's a supplier relationship. However, let's carry on now. Having established that the question that was asked doesn't relate to an outsourced process, but let's carry on assuming that it did. So, if it was an outsourced process, I would have to implement some sort of mechanism to make company B, my supplier in this case, aware of the particular EMS requirements that are related to what they're doing. Secondly, I would also need to determine if there are any tasks that can affect its environmental performance or ability to fulfill my compliance obligations, or are there anything that they're doing related to my emergency preparedness. So that comes back to an outsourced process taking place on my premises, like the example with the forklift truck engineer. If so, I would have to be required to establish some means of ensuring that those people are competent to perform out those tasks. If we go back to the forklift truck engineer working in a corner of my warehouse, I would have to make sure that that particular engineer was competent in terms of spillage, understood my spillage processes, knew what to do if that person had an environmental incident. Now, the interpretation of this has come from a couple of people. The interpretation of outsourcing appears to be different from 9001, is it? Yes, it is. Simply because in 9001, so let's take this example of electroplating, 9001, that process is being outsourced. If that outsourced process is wrong, then the quality of my products will be affected. So if those parts come back badly plated, it's affecting the quality of my output. If those parts, let's take it now from an environmental perspective. If those parts are electroplated and come back to me absolutely fine, however, during that electroplating process, the company have had an environmental incident, you could argue that's not my concern. Yes, it is really, but it's not affecting my environmental management system because it's happened at a supplier's process 200 miles away. It's not affected my process. It's because 9001 relates to the quality of the output, and my output would be plated components of which that person is carrying out that plating on my behalf. So that is an outsourced process, whereas when something's being carried out and there's some environmental impacts, those environmental impacts are not part of my scope. Right, so yes, somebody's put exactly many years ago, a canteen in an automotive company had a fire and one of their employees poured the burnt oil down the road drain, non-conformance raised correctly. Yeah, okay, somebody said electroplating may have implications for compliance obligations, REACH and things like that, and that's correct. There could be for things like REACH. REACH is environmental legislation, so there may be an element of that there. But generally, the first thing is to decide whether an outsourced process is part of your scope. Okay, so I think hopefully that puts that to bed. And as I say, if you want a more in-depth look at this, maybe have a look at last year's presentation, and there's a little bit more details. If you do, just as an aside, if you click on the link that I put on, I think it was slide 3 of this presentation, which looks at the original document, the PDF document from SC1, which runs to 39 pages, you will find again the previous information from their previous interpretations, and there was a much greater question about outsourced processes in there. Okay, going to push on. It's 3:05 here. I've gone 5 minutes over, but I'm guessing most of you don't have many places to dash off to, certainly if you're in the UK. So I've about another 5 minutes with the presentation, and then we'll be into questions. So, is it the intent of the requirement of clause 912, evaluative compliance, that only those working on behalf of the organisation conduct the evaluation, or can these evaluations include those conducted by regulatory authorities? And this is quite a good question and an interesting question. So in other words, evaluative compliance, do you have to do it yourself? Can you outsource it? Or can you use, for example, a large number of my clients have got permitted sites, permitted in the UK by the Environment Agency or permitted in England by the Environment Agency. They get regular visits by the Environment Agency that look at that process and by default are looking at some of the legal aspects. Can they use that type of information as evaluation of legal compliance? So, the intent of this clause is that any organisation determines how it will periodically evaluate compliance. And that choice or that determination can include evaluations done internally, can include, good news for you consultants listening, can include evaluation carried out by external consultants, and can include those carried out by regulatory authorities. It's a little bit of a cocktail, if you like, because you can use any or all of that. So an organisation can use information from regulatory authorities as part of the process, but can't rely on those audits or inspections alone. So for example, if one of my large permitted sites, when I asked for their evaluation of compliance, only showed me a compliance visit by the Environment Agency, they would not have demonstrated that they've evaluated compliance with all requirements, because the Environment Agency would only look at things related to the permit, and there will be commitments, evaluations that are required to be evaluated outside of that permit. So yes, they can be used, but only as part of a wider compliance evaluation process. 3 more to go. This sort of comes on to a question that was asked a little bit earlier about open-ended timeframes. Is there an expectation in the standard that compliance with all applicable compliance obligations will be assessed for all environmental media over the same timeframe? And it's suggested every 3 years. Or are periodic compliance assessments on a sampling basis based on environmental importance, history of non-compliance, etc., considered adequate? So in other words, do you have to do it in a given time frame? Do you have to do it within a year? Do you have to do it in whatever? So the standard requires that the organisation evaluates fulfilment of its compliance obligations, full stop. That's what the standard requires. It does not specify a particular methodology or frequency. You can do it how often you want, how you like. Periodic compliance assessment performed on a sampling basis may satisfy this requirement if, taken together, they cover all applicable compliance obligations over a period of time defined by the organisation. So if you want to do them over a 3-year period, based upon risk and history of non-compliance, say that you're going to do them over a 3-year period, show your assessor some sort of a plan or a program that shows what's going to be done annually, what's going to be done every other year, what's going to be done every 3 years. Show them that you're going to do it that way and explain to them the rationale for doing it in that way. It's your choice how you do it. It's not for us as assessors to tell you how often you should do this. And it certainly isn't for an assessor to say you have to do it every year. That is not the case. It's for you to decide and for you to explain your rationale for doing it. But it's for you to show and to decide over that what that time frame is going to be, and then demonstrate that you've got that process planned. Another one that's interesting, does the standard require companies to select internal auditors who are certified, have a background in environmental management, or have previous work experience in the environmental field? Consultants out there, close your ears at the moment. I have come across consultants possibly with an underlying slightly cheeky element of wanting to sell some training, have suggested that all internal auditors have to be trained and have to be certified. That is not the case. 14,001 under the clause 7.2 on competence doesn't contain specific requirements of certification, education or work experience. It requires that you as an organisation determine the necessary competence to carry out that role. So the intent of 14,001 is that you as an organisation decide what education, training or experience your internal auditors need. It's not for me as an assessor, it's not for your consultant as a consultant to tell you. If you decide that your internal auditors need a particular level of competence, it's for you to tell them that and for you to decide. However, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So in other words, when I come in and carry out, or when any of our auditors, when any certification body auditors come in and carry out that audit, they will look at your internal audits, they will look at how they've been carried out, they will look at the effectiveness of them. So clearly, it's in your interest to make sure that your internal auditors are competent to do that internal audit. Otherwise, you will find that you're getting a finding, not necessarily about the competence of the auditors, but on the integrity and the quality of the audits that have been carried out. But it's not for us, it's not for a consultant. The standard certainly doesn't require internal audits that are certified. And that, I think, is what I said earlier. I should have clicked on my mouse a bit earlier, got a bit carried away there. So there you go. That's what the standard actually is saying. One more, last lap. Does ISO 14001 section 922, so 922 is the internal audit program, does it require that organisations conduct an internal audit on an annual basis covering all elements of the standards? So this is a little bit like the question that was asked a couple of slides ago about evaluation of compliance, but this is now asking us about internal auditing. So in other words, reading between the lines, does the standard require that we audit the EMS or the whole EMS on an annual basis? Do we have to cover everything in one 12-month period? And I'm going to give the same answer that I gave 2 slides ago. First of all, no. So 922, section 922 requires that any organisation establishes the frequency of its EMS audits, full stop. So it's for you to decide. And since the standard does not define what that frequency is, these audits may or may not be conducted annually. The system or the standard says that the audit programme should take into consideration the environmental importance of the process being concerned, changes that might have happened over the year, and the results of previous audits. So for instance, if an audit shows that a process has got some real issues, then you might want to audit it more often. If you've changed the process, maybe an operating process within the business, if you've changed a manufacturing process, you might want to audit that process a little bit more often. If something is particularly environmentally important, if it relates to a significant aspect, you might want to audit a little bit more often. The standard does not require that all elements of 14,001 are audited each and every time an audit is carried out, nor does it require that every single element be audited within a 1-year period. Like I said about evaluation of compliance, set up an audit program. Define what the frequency is going to be. Is it annual? Is it biannual? Is it every 3 years? Whatever it's going to be, set that out in your program. Be prepared then to justify to an assessor why you're only doing that particular process every 3 years or every 2 years, or why you're doing that particular process every 6 months. That's what the standard requires, that you set out the process for auditing, you set out the program, and you justify why you've set it out as you've set it out. It's your decision. Right, we've got to the end. Yes, right, couple of questions. Is there no green text appearing? That was correct. Well, it should have appeared eventually. Is there an impact of 9,011 here? Yes, there is. I didn't cover that. The actual answer from the subcommittee does also suggest on auditing that you refer, this is down to the competence of auditors, it does also send you to 19,011 as well. So in other words, yes, there is, Andrew, but I chose not to put it in. I'm going to go back through the questions now. So if anybody wants to disappear, you can do. I think we've lost about 30 people so far, and that's fine. There's still a good number. We're still well into triple figures on those people listening in. Two things. One, you've got my contact details on that last slide, richard.walsh@nqa.com. I'm sat around doing some audits remotely, but also got a lot of time on my hands. If you want to fire off emails to me and questions and want to engage in discussions with me, feel free to do that. Send me an email, and when I reply, and I will reply to all of them, when I reply, you'll then see my specific contact details, telephone, and things like that. I'm not giving my telephone number out on here, but when I reply to an email, you'll see that. But feel free if you want to explore any of this any further, or if indeed you want to talk to me about any aspect of certification, or indeed you're not an NQA customer and you've liked what you've heard and you think, you know what, I think I'd like these guys to come and audit my system for me. So just to go through these last questions, I'm just going to work back in reverse order to go through any of the points that were made. If anybody else wants to ask any questions at the time being, I will cover them. Thanks, Liz. Liz says, thank you for a very informative webinar. I'll try and help my best. Andrew Burns-Warren, good old Andrew. How are you doing, Andrew? Good webinar, most interesting. Thank you. I've worked with Andrew over a long number of years, long before I came to NQA. Andrew and I have worked together. So going back through a couple of these questions. I would expect to review compliance if there was an incident or an environmental incident the previous time span. Absolutely, that's one of the things I did mention. If there's been environmental incidents, certainly I would expect compliance to be evaluated a little bit more often. Yes, under maybe emergency preparedness, if there's been an incident, yes, you need to review that incident. You need to look at has there been any learning coming out of that, and also maybe that might include tightening up on certain controls and also maybe auditing a little bit more. Can I also include third parties doing vetting inspections on hire and survey? Yes, you can. You can include anything you like. Anything that anybody does that contributes towards evaluation of compliance, it can be added. It's not a prohibitive list. You can add anything you like. As I said, it's a cocktail. You can put in what you like, so long as that cocktail of sources used to evaluate compliance covers everything, whether it includes legislative inspections done by a regulator, whether it includes something that you've employed a consultant to do, whether it's something you've done yourself. Some of my clients, fairly simply, you know, one manufacturing company, a number of manufacturing companies I work with, you know, some of the first tier supervision, they do a site walk once a week. They just walk around with their eyes open, looking at things. Why is that not on a bund? Why is that leaking? Why is that hose dripping? What's going down that drain? That's a legal audit. All of these are included within that process. So I've no more questions, I don't think. Hi from NQA Hungary. Hi back. Hello there. Take care, and you yourselves. Yes, you might be isolated like we are in the UK. So thank you very much. I've gone way over. It's 3:20 now here in the UK. So, but I hope you enjoyed it. Oh, keep typing. Somebody's just typing. So just hang on a sec. So I'm going to hang on. I'll carry on saying goodbye to those people that are leaving. Keep in touch. Drop me a line, drop me an email. If you've enjoyed it, drop me a line and say so, because it is useful. We all like positive feedback. Sunny Barnsley, thank you, Barnsley. Gordon, I'm in Halifax. I'm not a million miles from him. If I look out the window, I might nearly be able to see you. I'm on top of a hill in Halifax. So good on you, Gordon, and thank you for joining in. Thank you. Lots of thanks coming through. John Bloomer, I think you might have another question coming in. I'm waffling now because John's about to ask me a question, I think. Thank you, Susan. I will give you a call sometime, Susan, because we still need to get together to just have a chat about all sorts of aspects of 14,001 delivery. If you've got a webcam, Susan, we might be able to do it remotely. John, do you want to send me the question separately, because I'm hanging on now and I'm waffling. Oh, here we go. What about raising or not a non-conformance where legal is an implication, but that may cause the company significant cost? Thank you, Susan. Okay, yeah. I'm not sure about that. What about raising or not a non-conformance where legal is an implication, but that may cause the company significant? It could be. At the end of the day, raising a non-conformance as an assessor is really a discussion between yourself and the client. If you think that it's a legal issue, if the company are addressing it and aware of the issue and are dealing with it, even if it might be causing them cost, it's not really for you to raise a non-conformance. I tend to stick to raising legal non-conformances if I've spotted it, the company don't do anything about it, or the actions the company are taking are not appropriate to dealing with the issue. Anyway, if you want to have another chat about that, John, give me a call. I think you've probably got my contact details. Thank you to everybody. I mean whether it may oblige them to report themselves to the agency. That's an interesting one. Yes, they should. If their what's the phrase now? If their permit requires them to report themselves, to report an environmental incident to a regulator, and they haven't done that, then you've discovered a breach of legislation that they hadn't been aware of, and you're quite right in raising that. Right. All the best to everybody. Stay safe out there, guys. Look after yourselves, and I'll catch up with you on the next webinar. All right. Thanks a lot. Cheers, everybody. Bye-bye.